My name is Margaret Turner. I'm 62 years old, a widow, and for most of my life I believed family was my safe harbor. After Charles, my husband, passed away, I sold the little apartment we had built our life in, and I handed my son $120,000 from that sale. I told myself it was an act of trust, a gift to secure his future, and in turn my place in his heart. But what I never imagined was that years later, in the very house that still carried my name on the deed, that same son would raise his voice at me, his own mother, and scream words that cut deeper than any knife: "Pay your rent or get out." At that moment, I realized betrayal doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the ones you raised, the ones you sacrificed everything for. I still remember the sound of the realtor's voice echoing in my ears when I signed the papers to sell the little apartment in Cambridge. It was 2018, 3 years after my husband Charles passed away, and the place had started to feel unbearably empty. We had lived there for more than 2 decades, and every corner held a memory of him: the coffee mug left on the kitchen counter, the stack of crossword puzzles he never finished, the smell of his cologne that seemed to linger in the bedroom long after he was gone. Letting go of it was like letting go of him all over again, but I told myself it was practical. The building needed repairs, and climbing the narrow stairs had become harder on my knees. When the sale closed, I walked away with $280,000. It felt like more money than I had ever held in my life. For someone like me, a retired elementary school teacher living on a modest pension, it was a lifeline. My son Ethan came over that very evening, his face pale with stress. He was 35 then, working in IT at a small firm in Boston, and though he never liked to admit weakness, I could see the desperation in his eyes. "Mom," he said, pulling out a chair at the kitchen table, "I don't want to bother you, but Vanessa and I, we're drowning. Credit cards, medical bills, Olivia's school tuition, we're barely holding it together." I remember staring at him at the lines etched too deeply into his young face, and something inside me cracked. I thought of the promises Charles and I had whispered when Ethan was a baby, that we would always make sure he was safe, always give him the best start. What kind of mother would I be if I clung to money while my only son was sinking? So I wrote him a check for $120,000. My hand trembled slightly as I signed it, not from doubt, but from the weight of the decision. Ethan's eyes filled with tears, and he pulled me into a hug so tight I could hardly breathe. "You won't regret this, Mom," he said into my hair. "You'll never have to worry again. I'll take care of you." For a while those words carried me. I told myself I had done the right thing, that this was what Charles would have wanted me to do. And Ethan's gratitude seemed genuine. He called more often, invited me to dinners, let Olivia sleep over at my place on weekends. For the first time in years, I felt the closeness of family again. But life has a way of shifting beneath your feet. That same year I made another choice that seemed small at the time but turned out to matter more than I realized. Back in 2010, Charles and I had bought a modest colonial-style house in Quincy, thinking one day we might retire there. After he passed, I kept it as a rental property, hiring a manager to handle tenants. It was nothing fancy, but it was solid, with a front porch that caught the evening sun and a maple tree in the yard that blazed red every fall. I never sold it, never even thought to. It was mine, and it carried his name in spirit, even if only mine was on the deed. When Ethan and Vanessa suggested I move in with them, they made it sound like the perfect solution. "It'll be good for Olivia," Vanessa said with a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "She adores you, and we'll all save money this way." Ethan squeezed my hand, echoing her words. "Mom, you won't be alone anymore. We'll be a family under one roof." I wanted so badly to believe them. Loneliness had been eating at me for years, gnawing at the edges of my days. The thought of hearing Olivia's laughter down the hall, of having company at the dinner table, of not waking to an empty house, it filled me with a fragile hope. So I packed up my belongings, donated most of the furniture from the Cambridge apartment, and moved into the Quincy house with them. The place felt different with their touches. Vanessa's bright throw pillows, Ethan's flat-screen TV mounted in the living room. But I told myself it was just the way families blended. I still had my own room upstairs, a quiet space where I kept Charles's photograph on the nightstand. The first weeks were almost blissful. Olivia would curl up next to me in the evenings, asking for stories about her grandfather, about the way Ethan was as a boy. I'd smile and tell her how Ethan used to ride his bike down the block until dusk, or how he once tried to teach our old dog to fetch newspapers and ended up with shredded headlines all over the yard. Vanessa cooked elaborate dinners, and Ethan seemed lighter, more relaxed, even playful with his daughter. One night after dinner, as we washed dishes side by side, Ethan looked at me and said, "See, Mom, everything's going to be okay now. You don't have to worry anymore." I wanted to believe him. I clung to that promise, repeating it in my mind like a prayer. But deep inside, a quiet voice reminded me of the check I had written, of the years of savings I had poured into his hands. I hushed the voice. After all, wasn't this what family was for? I settled into the rhythms of the house. Morning coffee on the porch, school drop-offs with Olivia. Sunday dinners that ended in board games. It wasn't perfect, but it was warm, and it was something close to what I had been missing since Charles died. As I unpacked the last box in my room, I placed Charles's framed photograph on the dresser. His gentle smile looked back at me, steady and reassuring. "I did the right thing," I whispered to him. "Ethan promised." He said, "I'll never have to worry again." For a moment, with the autumn sun filtering through the curtains and Olivia's laughter drifting up the stairs, I let myself believe that promise was true. It didn't take long before the little things began to pile up. At first it was Vanessa sighing when I left my teacup on the counter or when I forgot to wipe down the stovetop after cooking oatmeal in the morning. She never said anything outright, just those small exhalations of disapproval that cut deeper than words. But soon enough she started making her feelings clearer. "Margaret," she said one afternoon as I pulled a casserole out of the oven, "I just cleaned this oven yesterday. Could you please put a tray under your dishes? It's hard to keep things nice when there are spills." I felt my cheeks warm. Of course, I said quickly, though I'd been baking the same way for decades. Another time I answered the phone in the kitchen when my friend Helen from church called. Vanessa walked in, glanced at me and frowned. "We really need the line open during the day. Ethan sometimes has work calls. Maybe you could take personal calls in your room." I nodded, swallowing back the sting. It wasn't worth a fight, I told myself. She was stressed trying to keep her household in order. I was the guest, wasn't I? But the truth was, it wasn't her house. It was mine. And yet day by day I felt the ground shifting beneath me, as though my presence was something to be tolerated rather than welcomed. Ethan noticed, I'm sure, but he rarely intervened. If anything, he leaned toward her side, chuckling awkwardly or saying, "Mom, just try to keep things tidy, okay?" I'd bite back the words I wanted to say, that I had raised him in a home where messes were part of living, that I had held him through fevers and scraped knees without ever keeping score. But the words stayed inside me, heavy and bitter. What kept me afloat was Olivia. Sweet Olivia with her wide brown eyes and her curiosity about everything. She'd slip into my room after school, curl up on my bed, and ask Grandma, tell me about Grandpa Charles again. I'd smile and smooth her hair back, telling her stories of the man she never met. How he used to whistle off-key when he worked in the garage. How he planted tulips every spring, even though the squirrels always dug them up. How proud he had been the day Ethan was born, pacing the hospital hallway with tears streaming down his face. She listened as if those stories were treasures, her little fingers tracing the edges of Charles's photograph on my nightstand. "I wish I could have met him," she'd whisper. "He would have loved you more than anything," I'd reply, pulling her close. Those moments reminded me why I had moved in, why I had sacrificed my savings. For family, for connection. Still, the tension in the house thickened. Dinner became an exercise in silence, broken only by Vanessa's clipped comments about grocery bills or utility costs. I'd hear her late at night talking to Ethan in their bedroom, her voice sharp, though I couldn't make out the words. In the mornings he'd look tired, his shoulders hunched as if he were carrying stones. One Saturday, as I was folding laundry in the living room, Vanessa came in with a basket of her own. She looked at the neat stacks I had made and pursed her lips. "You don't have to do our laundry, Margaret. We like things folded a certain way." I wanted to tell her I hadn't touched her clothes, only my own and Olivia's pajamas that she'd left in my room. But instead, I nodded and gathered my pile, retreating upstairs like a scolded child. It was a strange, humiliating sensation. At 62, after decades of raising a family and managing my own household, I felt reduced to tiptoeing around like a tenant on borrowed time. One evening, I overheard Vanessa on the phone with a friend. She laughed softly and said, "It's been an adjustment having Margaret here. Sometimes it feels like I'm running a boarding house." The words sliced through me. A boarding house. That's what she thought of me. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at Charles's picture, and whispered, "What am I doing here?" But then Olivia knocked gently and peeked in. "Grandma, can you help me with my science project?" she asked, holding a shoebox full of construction paper and markers. I forced a smile and nodded. "Of course, sweetheart. Let's make it the best volcano in the class." As we worked together, her laughter bubbling like the baking soda and vinegar experiment, the heaviness in my chest eased. I clung to those moments with her like a lifeline. Yet beneath the surface, I felt it growing, an invisible wall between me and the rest of the house. Every sigh from Vanessa, every look from Ethan when he chose silence over support, chipped away at the promise he had made to me. "You'll never have to worry again." I began to wonder if I had misunderstood him, or worse, if he had never really meant it at all. The nights grew longer, filled with restless turning in bed, the echoes of their muffled arguments seeping through the walls. I'd press my palms together, whispering prayers into the dark, hoping things would settle, that maybe it was just the stress of bills or work. But a voice inside me, the same one I had hushed when I wrote that check years ago, whispered louder now. "This is not your home anymore." I didn't want to believe it. Not yet. But the cracks were there, and I could feel them widening with every passing day. Dinner that night started out quietly, the clinking of silverware the only sound between us. Vanessa had made pasta with chicken, the smell of garlic still lingering in the air. I sat at the end of the table across from Olivia, who twirled her noodles carefully on her fork. Ethan scrolled through his phone between bites, glancing up now and then, but not really joining in. It was Vanessa who broke the silence. She set her fork down a little too hard, the metal striking the plate. "We need to talk about expenses," she said, her voice clipped. "The electric bill has nearly doubled. Groceries, too. It's a lot with an extra person in the house." My fork froze halfway to my mouth. The words landed like stones. She didn't look at me when she said it, but she didn't need to. I felt the heat rising to my cheeks. Ethan cleared his throat and finally put his phone down. "She's right, Mom. It's been tighter since you moved in. Maybe you could chip in a little, just to help with the costs." Chip in. The words echoed in my head. I stared at the pasta on my plate, suddenly tasteless. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. "Honestly, Margaret, it would be more fair if you contributed something like rent. That way everyone knows where they stand." "Rent?" She had said it plainly. I blinked, trying to process the air thick and heavy in my lungs. Across the table, Olivia's eyes widened. She reached under the table, her small hand sliding into mine, warm and trembling. I squeezed her fingers, desperate for something steady, as the room tilted around me. I couldn't find my voice. I looked at Ethan, my son, the boy I had raised, the boy Charles, and I had poured everything into. He couldn't even meet my eyes. In that silence, my mind betrayed me with memories. Writing that check for $120,000, watching Ethan's tears of gratitude, hearing his promise that I'd never have to worry again. I thought of selling the Cambridge apartment, the place Charles and I had built a life, and handing over those savings because I believed in my son, because I wanted to help him. And now here I was, sitting in the Quincy house that still bore my name on the deed, listening to my daughter-in-law suggest I pay rent. Listening to my son not object, not defend me, but nod along as though it were a reasonable thing to ask. I wanted to speak to remind them of the sacrifices I had made, the life I had given them, the roof over their heads that was still legally mine. But the words stuck in my throat like broken glass. Olivia's grip tightened, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Grandma," she whispered so softly I wasn't sure if anyone else heard. Vanessa picked up her fork again, as though the matter were settled. Ethan reached for his glass of water, avoiding my gaze, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. I forced myself to lift another bite of pasta, though it turned to ash in my mouth. The conversation shifted to Olivia's upcoming science fair, Vanessa chatting about poster boards and supplies. Ethan nodded along, making casual remarks, as if the words spoken moments earlier hadn't just split something inside me. I sat there, silent, my hand still wrapped around my granddaughter's beneath the table, my heart pounding against my ribs. The clinking of silverware sounded distant, muffled, like I was underwater. I thought of Charles, of what he would say if he could see this. He had worked himself weary to give us stability, to give Ethan a future. Would he be ashamed of the man our son had become? Or would he blame me for indulging him too much, for believing too easily in promises that were never kept? The evening dragged on, laughter, forced conversation, brittle. When dinner finally ended, I excused myself quietly, carrying my plate to the sink, rinsing it with trembling hands. No one followed me upstairs. In my room, I closed the door and leaned against it, my chest heaving. Charles's photograph sat on the dresser, his calm eyes watching me. I wanted to scream, to cry, to collapse onto the floor. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed, Olivia's small handprint still fresh in my palm, and whispered into the stillness, "What have I done?" It happened a week later over something as small as leftovers. I had warmed up a bowl of soup I'd made the night before, setting it on the counter with a piece of bread. Vanessa walked in, her eyes narrowing. "You didn't ask if anyone else wanted that. I was planning to give it to Olivia for lunch." I turned, startled. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize. There's still plenty in the pot." She cut me off with a sharp wave of her hand. "That's not the point, Margaret. You take things without thinking. This is our household, and you don't seem to respect that." Her voice rose, and I could feel the heat crawling up my neck. Before I could respond, Ethan came stomping in from the living room, his face already tight with anger. "What's going on now?" he demanded, looking from me to Vanessa. "She just doesn't think about anyone else," Vanessa snapped, throwing her hands in the air. "She eats whatever she wants, uses up the utilities piles on expenses, and then acts like it's nothing. I can't keep doing this." My chest clenched. "I didn't mean any harm," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I thought—" Ethan slammed his palm on the counter, making the dishes rattle. "Enough, Mom. We've talked about this before. You don't contribute. You don't help with the bills. You just sit here adding to our stress. Do you even realize what kind of pressure we're under?" I flinched at his words, staring at him in disbelief. My own son, standing in the kitchen I had bought with Charles years ago, speaking to me as if I were a stranger. He took a step closer, his voice rising to a shout that seemed to shake the walls. "Pay your rent or get out!" The words hit me like a physical blow. For a moment I couldn't breathe. Rent. In my own house. The deed still in my name, the mortgage long paid off with my own sacrifices and Charles's long hours of work. And yet here I was, being told I was a burden unwelcome unless I paid my way like some tenant off the street. My vision blurred. I saw Ethan's mouth still moving. Vanessa's arms crossed her lips, pressed into a thin line of triumph, but the sound of their voices faded under the roar in my ears. All I could think was how easily the promise had been broken, how quickly gratitude had soured into resentment. Olivia stood frozen in the doorway, her wide eyes filling with tears. She didn't say a word, but I felt her gaze burning into me silently, begging me not to fall apart. I steadied myself against the counter, my hands trembling. No words came. What could I say that I had given him my savings, that the roof over his head existed because of me, that his father would have been devastated to hear him speak this way? The truth caught in my throat like stones, so I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply picked up my half-finished bowl of soup, carried it quietly to the sink, and poured it down the drain. The silence that followed was heavier than any shouting. Ethan muttered something under his breath. Vanessa turned back to her phone, and the house felt suddenly foreign, hostile, no longer a place of family, but a place where I was trespassing. I walked past Olivia, resting my hand briefly on her shoulder. Her small fingers clutched mine for a second before I slipped away. Upstairs, in the solitude of my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at Charles's photograph. My chest ached so deeply it felt as though my ribs might crack under the weight. I thought of the Cambridge apartment, of the check I had written, of Ethan's words. "You'll never have to worry again." How quickly those promises had dissolved into a demand that I pay rent or leave. The house was mine on paper, but in every other sense it no longer belonged to me. It belonged to them. Their rules, their disdain, their voices louder than my own. I lay back slowly, listening to the muffled sounds of their laughter drifting up from the kitchen, and closed my eyes against the sting of tears. My heart felt heavier than it ever had, but I forced myself to breathe one steady breath at a time, waiting for the storm inside me to quiet enough to face whatever would come next. The next morning I woke with a heaviness I couldn't shake. The echoes of Ethan's voice still rang in my ears. "Pay your rent or get out." And I knew I couldn't keep drifting in silence. Something inside me insisted I needed to see for myself, to hold proof of what I already knew deep down. I went to the old cedar filing cabinet in my room, the one I'd kept through every move since Charles and I first married. My hands trembled as I slid open the drawer, rifling through folders marked with neat black labels: taxes, insurance, medical, mortgage. Finally, I found the thick envelope labeled Quincy House. I spread the papers across my bed. There it was, the deed from 2010, when Charles and I had signed for this home. His name had been crossed out after his passing, leaving only mine. Clear as day, Margaret Turner, sole owner. I sat back, staring at the letters as though they might blur if I blinked too hard. Sole owner. This house was mine, and yet I had sat in that kitchen the night before being told to pay rent or leave. Clutching the deed, I felt the stirrings of something I hadn't felt in years. Resolve. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't powerless. I made a call that afternoon to a local attorney, James Patterson, whose office was on Hancock Street downtown. He'd handled probate for a friend of mine years ago. When his secretary offered me an appointment the next day, I accepted without hesitation. The office was modest, lined with shelves of thick law books and framed certificates. Mr. Patterson, a tall man with graying hair and a calm demeanor, welcomed me with a firm handshake. "What brings you in today, Mrs. Turner?" I laid the papers on his desk, my voice unsteady but clear. "I need to understand exactly what these mean. My son and his wife. They've been treating me like a tenant, but I believe this house is mine." He adjusted his glasses and scanned the documents carefully. After a few minutes, he looked up his expression, leaving no room for doubt. "Mrs. Turner, you are correct. According to this deed, you are the sole owner of the property. You have full legal authority. No one, not your son, not his wife, can force you to pay rent or remove you from this home. Only you decide what happens here." The breath I'd been holding released in a shaky rush. "So, I'm not at their mercy." "Not in the slightest," he said firmly. "This is your property. If anyone should feel like a guest here, it's them." He slid the deed back toward me, then placed a freshly printed copy on top. The words bold and undeniable: Margaret Turner, sole owner. I picked it up, my fingers tightening around the crisp paper. For the first time in months, I felt the ground beneath me solid again. "Mr. Patterson's voice softened. "Mrs. Turner, you've been through something deeply painful, but the law is on your side. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." I nodded, my throat tight with gratitude and something fiercer, anger maybe, but also a quiet strength I thought I'd lost. As I walked out of his office, The cool autumn air of Quincy filled my lungs. The deed was tucked safely into my bag, but I held onto it as if it were a shield. For so long I had bent under the weight of Ethan's silence and Vanessa's disdain, letting their voices drown out my own. Now in my hands I carried proof that my place in that house wasn't charity or burden. It was right. On the bus ride home, I stared out the window at the streets I'd known for decades. Every storefront, every corner held some memory of the life Charles and I had built together. I thought of Olivia, how her little hand had clung to mine under the dinner table. She needed me to be strong to show her that family wasn't supposed to mean humiliation. When I reached the house, I unlocked the front door with steady hands. The sound of laughter floated from the kitchen. Vanessa's sharp, high-pitched, Ethan's lower rumble. I didn't go in. Not yet. I climbed the stairs to my room, shut the door, and laid the deed carefully in the top drawer of my nightstand. My reflection in the mirror caught my eye. I didn't look defeated anymore. I looked older, yes, but steady. I ran my fingers across the copy one more time, tracing the letters of my own name, Margaret Turner, sole owner. For the first time in a long while, I felt something close to peace, though, underneath it. A quiet fire burned, waiting for the moment when I would no longer keep silent. It started with a trip to the corner store. I was coming back with a small bag of milk and bread when I passed Mrs. Whitaker, the elderly neighbor who had lived down the block longer than we had. She squinted at me over her oversized sunglasses, then gave a sharp little laugh. "Funny thing, Margaret," she said, her voice carrying louder than it should have. "Everyone knows that house of yours is in your name. Guess some folks forgot who really owns it." Her words were meant to sting, but not at me. I felt the heat of humiliation flush across my face. Not for myself, but for Ethan and Vanessa, who were standing on the porch within earshot. I saw Vanessa stiffen her lips pressed thin, while Ethan shifted his weight like a boy caught stealing candy. Mrs. Whitaker walked off with a smirk, leaving the air between us heavy and sour. That night the storm broke. Ethan slammed his briefcase onto the dining table and glared at me. "This is your fault, Mom. People are talking, making us look like fools. Do you have any idea what that does to me at work?" I looked at him steadily. "Miss." "I didn't say a word to anyone." Vanessa's voice cut in sharp as a blade. "Oh, please. You think Mrs. Whitaker magically knows about deeds and ownership? You must have gone around bragging, rubbing it in everyone's faces." I shook my head slowly, but my silence only seemed to fuel her anger. She threw her napkin down, eyes flashing. "You live here like a guest, but strut around as if you're the landlord. In front of Olivia, no less. It's disgraceful." Olivia, sitting across the table, stiffened. Her fork clattered to the plate. "That's not true," she shouted, her small voice breaking. Tears welled in her eyes. "Grandma doesn't act like that. You're the ones who—" "Enough!" Ethan barked, his voice so loud that Olivia flinched and burst into sobs. She pushed back her chair and ran to me, burying her face in my side. My arms went around her instinctively, her shaking shoulders fitting against me like they had since she was a baby. I stroked her hair, murmuring softly, while my own chest burned with grief and rage. Vanessa's words hung in the air, cruel and deliberate, and Ethan's silence in the face of them cut deeper than anything. Later that evening, when the house quieted, I sat alone in my room, listening to the muted sound of Ethan and Vanessa's voices downstairs. Low, tense, and edged with panic. I caught fragments when I passed the staircase. "Money owed Jim won't wait much longer. I told you I'd get it." It didn't take much to piece together. Ethan was in trouble debts with people he shouldn't have borrowed from. Vanessa's sharp tone wasn't just anger anymore. It was fear pressed into every word. I returned to my room and closed the door. Olivia, already asleep, curled up against my quilt. I looked at her small hand resting on my arm and felt something shift inside me. Their cruelty had been growing for months, but tonight it reached into the heart of our family. Vanessa had humiliated me in front of Olivia, trying to poison her against me, and Ethan had let it happen. My son, who had once promised to take care of me, was now drowning in his own mess and dragging me down with him. I opened my nightstand drawer and touched the deed Mr. Patterson had copied for me. The paper was cool under my fingers, but it felt alive like a quiet heartbeat, reminding me that I still had power. I sat there in the dim lamplight, the sound of Olivia's soft breathing filling the room. And I made a choice. I wouldn't shout. I wouldn't argue. But I would act. I would not let my son's debts or his wife's venom turn my home into a prison. For the first time in weeks, I felt something calm settle over me, sharper than despair, and steadier than anger. It was resolve clear and unshakable. I smoothed the blanket over Olivia's shoulder and whispered to myself, "It's time." The following Monday, I dialed the number of Carla Jennings, a realtor I had known from church years ago. My voice was steady when I asked if she had time to meet. We sat in her small office on Hancock Street, surrounded by property listings pinned to the walls. I slid the deed across her desk, my hands calm even as my heart pounded. "I'm considering selling," I told her quietly. "But before that, I need to set things straight. I need to end any illusion that I'm just a guest in my own home." Carla adjusted her glasses and nodded. "Margaret, this deed is clear. You're the sole owner. If you want to sell or even just put the property on notice, you can. I'll help however you need." Later that week, I sat in Attorney Patterson's office again. He listened carefully as I explained what had been happening. His face tightened with quiet disapproval, but his words were measured. "You have every right to act. If you want me to, I can draft a formal notice to terminate their occupancy. Legally, you must give them 60 days. After that, they'll have no grounds to remain here." I nodded slowly, my pulse steady. "Do it." The paperwork was straightforward. Patterson prepared the notice stamped and signed each line a quiet testament to my resolve. My hand didn't shake as I signed my name. The pen glided across the page with a finality that made me feel for the first time in months like I was breathing freely again. I tucked the papers into a manila envelope and brought them home, sliding them into the drawer beside the deed. For a few days, I carried on as though nothing had changed. I cooked small meals, folded laundry, let Olivia chatter about school as we walked to the corner store. Ethan and Vanessa didn't suspect. Then one evening, as the light slanted across the kitchen, Ethan came in from the mailbox with an envelope in his hand. He ripped it open, his eyes skimming the text, and then his face turned red. "What the hell is this?" he roared, slamming the notice down on the table so hard the salt shaker tipped over. His chest heaved as he glared at me. 60 days. You're kicking us out. Out of this house. I sat at the table, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I didn't rise to his volume. "It's not your house, Ethan. It never was. It's mine." Vanessa came rushing in, snatching the paper from the table. She scanned it, her face twisting in disbelief before the fury broke through. "You can't do this. We've built our lives here. Olivia goes to school here. You'll ruin everything. You'll regret this, Margaret. You'll regret it." Her voice cracked into a scream. "You'll be all alone." Her words bounced off me like stones thrown against a wall too thick to break. I kept my gaze steady, my voice low. "You've made it clear I'm not welcome here unless I pay rent. Well, now I'm making it clear. This is my house, and I won't be treated like a tenant any longer." Ethan shoved the chair back so hard it scraped across the tile. He paced the kitchen, fists clenched, muttering curses. Vanessa's eyes burned holes into me, her chest rising and falling with rage. In the corner, Olivia stood frozen, her schoolbook still in her arms. Her wide eyes flicked from her father to me, fear and confusion etched into her small face. I didn't look away. I didn't apologize. I sat there with Patterson's notice lying between us, the truth finally on paper undeniable. That night, the house felt like it was holding its breath. Every footstep upstairs was heavy, every slammed door a reminder of the storm that had broken. But inside myself, there was no storm anymore. Only stillness. I had acted quietly but firmly. The papers were signed, the notice delivered. Whatever chaos Ethan and Vanessa tried to stir, the countdown had already begun. 60 days. The meeting took place in Patterson's office, the blinds half closed against the late afternoon sun. The air felt thick with tension before a single word was spoken. Ethan stormed in first, his lawyer in tow, a sharp-faced man who introduced himself curtly as Howard Mills. Vanessa followed her heels, clicking across the hardwood floor like gunshots. Ethan dropped into the chair opposite me with a glare, slamming a folder onto the table. "This is ridiculous, Mom. You can't just throw us out like this. I've got a family, a daughter. We've built a life here." His voice rose with each word until it cracked with fury. Vanessa leaned forward, eyes blazing. "You've lost your mind, Margaret. Who does this to their own child, after everything we've done to accommodate you?" Patterson raised a calm hand, his voice even. "Let's proceed with facts, not accusations. Mr. Turner." "Mrs. Turner. I've reviewed the documents. This house purchased in 2010 is deeded solely in Mrs. Margaret Turner's name. I have copies of the original deed here along with tax records for the past decade, all paid under her name. Legally, there's no ambiguity." He slid the stack of papers across the table, the crisp edges cutting through the heated air. Howard Mills picked up the documents, flipping through them quickly. His brow furrowed as he turned each page, the silence dragging out longer than Ethan could stand. "This doesn't matter," Ethan shouted, slamming his fist against the table. "She's my mother. She can't just kick us out on the street." "She can," Patterson said firmly. "And she is. The notice was properly served. You have 60 days. That's generous considering the circumstances." Vanessa let out a sharp laugh, bitter and hollow. "Generous. You call tearing apart your own family generous? You're pathetic, Margaret. You'll die alone in some nursing home and we won't lift a finger to help you." Her words sliced through the room, but I didn't flinch. I folded my hands neatly in front of me and looked her squarely in the eye. "This is my house. That's not an opinion, it's a fact. And you have 60 days. No more, no less." For the first time, Vanessa's mouth snapped shut, her bravado faltering under the weight of the papers in front of her. Howard Mills cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Legally, she's correct," he admitted. Ethan shot him a look of betrayal, his face flushed with humiliation. "So that's it. You're telling me I don't have a leg to stand on?" Howard hesitated, then sighed. "Unless you can prove she gifted or transferred ownership, which she hasn't, you can't contest this." The room fell into a heavy silence. Ethan's fists clenched his jaw tight as he stared at the table, refusing to meet my eyes. Vanessa shoved her chair back abruptly, the legs screeching against the floor. "This is a waste of time," she spat, grabbing her purse. "Come on, Ethan. Let her rot in her precious house." She strode out the door, slamming behind her with a force that rattled the frame. Ethan lingered for a moment longer, his face pale, his breath shallow. He looked at me finally, his eyes a storm of anger, and something else, fear maybe. Then he turned without a word and followed her out. The room was quiet again, the sound of the door echoing into stillness. Patterson gathered the papers back into their folder, sliding them toward me. "You did the right thing," he said gently. "It's never easy, but you're protecting yourself." I knotted my throat tight but steady. My fingers brushed the edge of the deed, the ink of my name bold against the page. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel invisible. I felt solid. As I left the office and stepped into the cool evening air, the world felt a little lighter, though I knew the storm at home had only just begun. The for sale sign went up on the lawn in early spring, its bright red letters startling against the soft green grass. Within days, Carla was bringing couples through their footsteps, echoing on the floors I had scrubbed for years. It was strange watching strangers peer into the kitchen where I had baked birthday cakes for Ethan as a boy, or measure the living room with their eyes imagining their own furniture where mine had stood. But instead of sadness, I felt an unexpected calm, like the closing of a chapter long overdue. The offer came quicker than I could have imagined. A young family eager to settle in Quincy offered $675,000. Carla called me with the news, her voice bright with excitement. "They're solid buyers, Margaret. Pre-approved. We can close fast if you're ready." "I'm ready," I answered, and I meant it. The days that followed were filled with cardboard boxes and the rustle of packing tape. I sorted through closets, wrapping dishes in old newspapers, deciding what to keep and what to let go. It was exhausting, but each box sealed was a weight lifted. Olivia appeared at my door one afternoon, clutching a roll of bubble wrap. "Grandma, can I help?" she asked, her eyes shining with the earnestness only 12-year-olds carry. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, handing her a stack of books. She knelt beside me carefully, wrapping them, her small hands serious in their work. As the sun dipped low, she set the last book in the box and looked at me with eyes too wise for her age. "I'll always find you, Grandma. Even if you're not here, I'll come see you. Promise." My throat tightened, and I reached out, pulling her into my arms. The scent of her shampoo apples and something sweet filled my senses as tears slipped down my cheeks. "I know you will, Olivia. And I'll always be here for you no matter where I live." She held me tightly, her thin arms fierce around my neck. In that moment, the house around us felt less like a place and more like a shell I was finally shedding. At night, when the boxes were stacked high against the walls, I would sit quietly with a cup of tea, listening to the silence. Ethan and Vanessa barely spoke to me anymore. They moved through the house like angry ghosts, slamming doors, whispering sharp words they didn't bother to hide. But I didn't let it reach me. The deed was settled. The buyers were waiting. I walked from room to room, sometimes touching the door frames, running my hand along the banister. I remembered Charles carrying Olivia up those stairs when she was a toddler. Remembered the laughter that once filled these walls. Those memories stayed with me, but the bitterness of recent years no longer clung the same way. One evening, as I taped up the last kitchen box, Ethan walked in, his face pale and drawn. He didn't shout this time. He just looked at the stacks of boxes, his lips pressed thin. "So it's really happening," he muttered. "It is," I said simply, my voice calm. He shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping. "You'll regret this." Then he turned and left the door clicking shut behind him. But I didn't regret it. I looked around at the bare counters, the cleared shelves, and I felt lighter than I had in years. This wasn't just about selling a house. It was about releasing myself from a weight I should never have carried. It was about reclaiming my dignity and stepping into whatever came next with both hands free. The closing papers were signed, and by the time summer rolled in, the Quincy house no longer belonged to me. I moved into a quiet 2-bedroom condo near the harbor, where the sound of gulls carried in through my windows, and the air smelled faintly of salt. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe without waiting for the next sharp word or slammed door. But word traveled fast. It didn't take long before neighbors and even old acquaintances let slip what had become of Ethan and Vanessa. They'd rented a cramped apartment in the city, a far cry from the suburban comfort they had strutted through like it was their kingdom. I heard whispers that Vanessa had shut down her livestream channel altogether, too embarrassed to show the world the peeling paint and narrow rooms behind her. Ethan, I was told, had taken on extra shifts and side jobs, but the debts he carried were heavier than his shoulders could bear. The friends he once boasted to had stopped returning his calls, and his pride, once so sharp it could cut, was now dulled into silence. I never sought out these updates, but they reached me anyway. At the grocery store, at church, in line at the post office. Someone always had a story, a little nugget of gossip about how far they had fallen. Each time I would nod politely, my heart a mixture of sorrow and resignation. One afternoon, as I walked through downtown Boston, I saw them. Ethan and Vanessa coming out of a discount store, grocery bags straining their hands. Ethan's frame looked thinner, his shirt hanging loose where it once fit snug. Vanessa's hair, always styled to perfection for her streams, was tied back hastily, her face drawn. They didn't see me at first. I stood across the street, my breath catching in my chest. There was a time I would have rushed forward, offered to help, tried to fix what was broken, but that time was gone. Ethan finally glanced up, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. His gaze flickered with something raw, shame, anger, maybe even a plea. I held it steady and calm, then lowered my eyes and walked past my steps, measured my heart steady. Behind me, I heard Vanessa's voice, sharp and impatient. "Hurry up, Ethan! We're going to miss the bus." I didn't turn back. I kept walking, the city alive around me, each step carrying me further from the wreckage of their choices. People would call it karma, and maybe that's true, but to me it was simply the truth catching up. What is built on greed and lies cannot stand forever. And though the sight of my son's hollow face would always ache somewhere deep inside me, I knew this much: I had chosen dignity, and for once I had chosen myself. I sat across from Mr. Patterson in his office, the faint scent of leather and old books filling the room. He slid the papers toward me, his pen resting neatly on top. "This will secure Olivia's future," he said gently. "She'll receive part when she turns 18, enough to cover college without worry. The remainder she can access at 25 if she chooses to start a business or buy a home." My hand hovered over the pen for a moment. I thought of Ethan, of the promises he had made, and broken, of the bitter words he had flung at me across our dinner table. My son had taken what I gave him and turned it into ash. But Olivia, she was different. She still looked at me with love, untainted and sincere. I signed my name, slowly pressing each letter as though carving it into stone. When I set the pen down, I felt something lift inside me. Walking home, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the harbor. I paused by the railing, watching the boats drift lazily across the water. My chest tightened with both grief and relief. I had lost my son in more ways than one, but I would not lose my granddaughter's future. That evening the phone rang, and when I answered, Olivia's small, shaky voice filled my ear. "Grandma, I'm here, sweetheart," I said softly. There was a pause. Then her words spilled out in a rush. I just want you to know I understand. About the house. About everything. Dad and Mom, they don't talk about it, but I see what's happening. And I know you still care. I know you love me." I pressed the receiver tighter, my eyes burning. "Olivia, you'll never have to doubt that. You are the light I carry no matter what." She sniffled, then gave a little laugh. "I love you too, Grandma." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my condo, the night settling around me. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the sting of betrayal as sharply. Instead, I felt a calm warmth spread through me. By putting those papers in place, I hadn't just secured Olivia's education or her dreams. I had drawn a line through the pain of the past and planted something lasting, something good for the future. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence settle, and whispered to myself, "At least she'll know she was always worth fighting for." The day I moved into my new condo, the sun was pouring through the wide windows, touching every corner with warmth. It wasn't large, just 2 bedrooms, a modest kitchen, and a little balcony that overlooked the harbor. But as I unpacked the first box, I felt something I hadn't in years: safety. I set the framed photograph of Charles on the mantel first. His smile, frozen in time, greeted me like an old friend. I whispered, "We made it." "Charles?" I finally kept my promise to myself. The walls were bare at first, the rooms echoing with emptiness, but with every curtain hung and every book stacked on the shelf, it began to feel like mine. Truly mine. No raised voices, no slammed doors, no cruel demands disguised as casual conversation. Just silence broken only by the sound of gulls outside and the hum of life returning to me. Each morning I brewed coffee and sat by the balcony watching boats cut through the water. Sometimes I let my mind wander back through the path that brought me here. The trust I placed in Ethan, the betrayal that followed the cruel words that shattered me, and the quiet strength I had to summon to take it all back. For a long time, I thought losing the house would mean losing my home, but now I see it was never about bricks or walls. It was about dignity. It was about peace. Olivia called me often. Her laughter through the phone was a melody softening the ache left behind. She'd tell me about school projects, about books she was reading, and about the silly arguments her parents still had. I listened not with the weight of worry anymore, but with the calm assurance that at least for her, I had planted something steady to hold on to. Sometimes I would walk through Quincy past the streets that once defined my life. People still whispered stories about Ethan and Vanessa, about how pride had cost them comfort, about how quickly fortunes could change. I no longer felt bitterness hearing their names, only distance, a closed chapter. Back at home, I'd glance at Charles's picture and smile. I realized I didn't need a grand house or the illusion of family unity to feel whole. I needed only the strength to choose myself when no one else would. I may not live in the biggest house on the street anymore, but within these walls, I have something far greater. I have my dignity. I have my peace. And now I want to ask you, if it had been you sitting in that chair hearing your own child demand rent in a house you owned, would you have stayed silent and endured? Or would you have stood up quietly but firmly as I did? Share your thoughts with me. I'd love to know.